"That's impossible," Daniel Carter whispered the moment he saw the newborn, his voice barely louder than the steady hum of machines in the quiet Chicago hospital room. And yet the words seemed to freeze the air around him, because Daniel Carter was not a man who said impossible, not a man who doubted numbers, contracts, or outcomes. Not the billionaire founder of Carter Dynamics who had built a $3 billion tech empire before the age of 40 by believing that every problem could be solved with the right calculation, the right investment, the right deal. And yet in that moment, as he stared down at the tiny child wrapped in a white hospital blanket beneath the soft fluorescent lights, something in his perfectly ordered world cracked open, because the child had a small crescent-shaped birthmark just beneath the left shoulder, the same rare mark carried by the men in Daniel's family for 3 generations. A mark his father used to joke was the Carter signature, and suddenly, Daniel felt a strange chill travel down his spine because that mark was supposed to belong only to blood, only to family. And this child, this carefully arranged child born from a contract signed 9 months earlier, was never supposed to carry anything that personal, anything that real. And yet there it was, unmistakable, impossible, undeniable. And the quiet nurse beside the bed glanced up at Daniel with a curious look, as if wondering why the composed billionaire looked suddenly like a man who had just discovered a secret hidden in plain sight. But to understand why Daniel Carter looked so shaken standing in that hospital room on a rainy October night in Chicago, you have to rewind 9 months to the moment this impossible story began, on a cold March evening, when Daniel stepped out of the back seat of a black Escalade in downtown Chicago and walked past the bright glass windows of a shelter on Monroe Street, where a line of people waited quietly beneath a flickering streetlight. Daniel had never planned to stop there. Men like him moved through the city in carefully managed schedules measured in conference calls, board meetings, and flights between New York and San Francisco. But that night a charity advisor had insisted he visit one of the community shelters his foundation funded. Daniel didn't believe much in charity. In his experience, money solved problems more efficiently when attached to strategy rather than emotion. Still, he had agreed to make a brief appearance, shake a few hands, and sign a donation check before heading to a dinner with investors at a steakhouse 5 blocks away. Inside the shelter, the air smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent, a modest warmth against the sharp wind outside. Volunteers moved between tables serving bowls of soup, while quiet conversations filled the room. Daniel stood near the entrance in his tailored navy coat, clearly out of place in a room where most people wore layers of worn jackets and knit hats. He listened politely as the shelter director spoke about programs and funding gaps, but his mind wandered the way it often did when emotions rather than logic drove a conversation. Then he noticed her sitting alone near the far wall, a woman with dark brown hair pulled into a loose knot, her posture straight despite the simple gray coat draped around her shoulders. She wasn't talking to anyone, just reading a paperback book beneath the dim overhead light like the rest of the room had faded into the background. Daniel found himself oddly curious. Most people in shelters avoided eye contact or carried the heavy look of exhaustion. But this woman looked calm, almost determined, like someone temporarily paused rather than defeated. The director followed Daniel's gaze. "Her name is Elena Brooks," the director said quietly. "She's been here about 3 weeks." Daniel nodded slowly and walked across the room, something rare for him because Daniel Carter never approached strangers without purpose. Elena looked up as he stopped beside the table. Her eyes were sharp, observant. She noticed the expensive watch, the polished shoes, the quiet confidence that usually surrounded powerful men. "Can I help you?" she asked calmly. Daniel considered the question for a moment, then said something that would change both of their lives forever. "I have a proposal," he said. Elena raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the unusual introduction. Daniel placed a small leather folder on the table and spoke in the same steady voice he used in boardrooms. "I'm looking for someone willing to carry a child," he said, "and I'm prepared to pay $2 million for the arrangement." Elena stared at him for a long silent moment, as if trying to decide whether the man in front of her was serious or completely out of his mind. Then she closed the book slowly and said something Daniel Carter had not expected to hear from anyone in years. "You can't buy a human life like a business contract," she said quietly. Daniel gave a faint smile, because he had spent most of his life proving that almost everything could become a contract if the numbers were right. Maybe not, he replied, but you can buy an opportunity. Elena looked at the folder on the table, but didn't touch it. And why me? She asked. Daniel answered with the blunt honesty that made people either respect him or resent him. Because you have nothing tying you down, he said. No legal obligations, no complicated history, and according to the background report my team ran earlier today, you used to be a molecular biologist before your research grant collapsed. Elena's expression hardened slightly. So you investigated me before even speaking to me. Daniel shrugged lightly. I investigate everything before investing in it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the shelter window, a gust of cold wind rattled the glass. Finally, Elena leaned back in her chair and studied him with a thoughtful look. $2 million, she repeated quietly. Enough to rebuild a life, Daniel said. Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced down at the leather folder on the table, as if she could already sense the weight of the decision inside it. And somewhere deep in Daniel Carter's perfectly calculated plan, something unpredictable had just begun. Elena Brooks did not touch the leather folder for nearly a full minute after Daniel Carter slid it across the table, and that silence told Daniel more about her than any background report his analysts had prepared, because most people reacted immediately when they heard a number like $2 million, their eyes widening, their voices shifting, their decisions forming in seconds. But Elena simply studied the folder as if she were weighing something much heavier than money. Around them, the shelter moved quietly through its evening routine. Someone laughed softly near the coffee station. A volunteer stacked empty bowls beside the kitchen door. Outside the tall windows, the Chicago wind swept along Monroe Street, rattling the metal street signs and carrying the distant sound of traffic. Finally, Elena looked back up at Daniel with the calm focus of someone who had spent years thinking carefully before speaking. Why would someone like you want a child through a contract? She asked. Daniel had expected curiosity, maybe suspicion, but the question still made him pause because it was direct and personal in a way most people avoided when talking to him. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, resting his hands lightly on the table. Because emotions complicate things, he answered honestly. Elena raised an eyebrow. Children are emotions, she said. Daniel almost smiled at that because she was not wrong. For most of his life, Daniel had treated relationships the same way he treated business decisions: measured, strategic, controlled. His father had built Carter Industries with the same philosophy and had raised Daniel to believe that personal attachments were distractions that weakened judgment. Daniel had followed that lesson well, perhaps too well. By 40 years old, he had wealth, influence, and a reputation as one of the most disciplined entrepreneurs in American tech. Yet his life outside the boardroom was almost entirely empty. A year earlier, his father had passed away, leaving Daniel not only the family fortune, but also a final conversation that lingered in his mind more than he liked to admit. The old man had looked at him from the hospital bed and said, "You built the company stronger than I ever did, but you forgot something important along the way." Daniel had asked what that was. A future that belongs to someone after you. At the time, Daniel had dismissed the comment as sentimentality, but months later the thought returned again and again. He had no partner, no family, no heir to the empire he had built. And for the first time in his life, he realized that his perfectly controlled world had no continuation beyond himself. So he approached the problem the same way he approached everything else. With a plan. With lawyers. With contracts. Elena listened carefully as Daniel explained part of this reasoning, though he left out the more personal details. When he finished, she leaned back slightly and folded her arms. "So you want a child the way someone orders a custom car," she said quietly. Daniel did not flinch at the comparison. "I want stability," he said, "and I am offering enough money to change your circumstances permanently." Elena glanced around the shelter for a moment as if reminding herself where she was sitting. The room was modest but warm, filled with people whose lives had taken sudden turns that none of them expected. When she spoke again, her voice carried a hint of weariness but also quiet strength. $2 million does not erase a decision like that. Daniel nodded slowly. "No, it does not. But it might open doors that are currently closed." Elena studied him again, this time with deeper curiosity. "You said your team looked into my past," she said. "That means you already know I used to have doors open." Daniel did know. The report his analysts compiled earlier that week described Elena Brooks as a promising molecular biologist who once worked at a respected research institute in Illinois. 5 years earlier, her grant funding had collapsed after a corporate partnership withdrew unexpectedly. Without funding, her research program shut down, her apartment lease ended, and a series of temporary jobs followed until eventually there were none left. Daniel had read the summary in less than 3 minutes. Yet the human story behind those bullet points sat across from him now in the form of a woman whose composure remained remarkably steady despite everything she had lost. People rebuild after setbacks all the time, Daniel said carefully. Elena gave a small, thoughtful smile. Sometimes they do, she replied. Sometimes the latter disappears completely. She looked down at the leather folder again. Inside were pages of legal language prepared by Daniel's attorneys. Clear terms. Clear boundaries. Financial transfers scheduled across 9 months. Medical care provided by one of the best private clinics in Chicago. Daniel had designed the arrangement the same way he structured a corporate acquisition, every possible outcome considered in advance. Yet something about Elena's quiet hesitation made the situation feel less predictable than he expected. What happens after the child is born? She asked. The agreement states that you receive full financial compensation and complete freedom to continue your life however you choose, Daniel said. And the child? She asked. The child becomes part of my family, Daniel answered. Elena's eyes lingered on his for a moment as if trying to determine whether the word family actually meant anything to him. Then she asked one final question that Daniel had not anticipated. And what if the plan changes? She said softly. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Plans do not change if they are written clearly enough, he replied. Elena looked at him for a long moment, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached forward and placed her hand on the leather folder. The movement was small, but Daniel sensed that it carried the weight of a decision neither of them fully understood yet. Outside the shelter, the wind continued to sweep along Monroe Street, and somewhere in the city a storm was beginning to gather, though neither Daniel Carter nor Elena Brooks realized yet how deeply their lives were about to become connected. Elena Brooks did not open the leather folder until nearly an hour after Daniel Carter had left the shelter, and by the time she finally unfolded the thick stack of documents, the building had grown quiet. The volunteers had finished cleaning the kitchen, and only the soft hum of fluorescent lights remained above the rows of simple tables. She sat alone with a cup of lukewarm coffee beside her and slowly turned the first page, her eyes scanning the clean legal language that described the arrangement in calm, precise detail. Daniel Carter had clearly built the agreement the same way he built his companies, with structure, clarity, and almost surgical logic. Every responsibility was defined, every payment scheduled. Medical care, housing, transportation, insurance, and legal protection were all outlined with impressive thoroughness. For a moment, Elena almost laughed softly to herself because she could see the mind of the man who wrote this plan without ever needing to hear another word from him. Daniel Carter believed life worked best when variables were controlled. Yet Elena also understood something that Daniel might not fully grasp. Human lives rarely followed contracts the way businesses did. She closed the folder slowly and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling while the quiet shelter around her settled into nighttime silence. $2 million was not simply a number. It was the difference between sleeping in a shelter and rebuilding the career she once thought would change the world. Years earlier, Elena had spent long nights in laboratories studying molecular patterns under bright white lights, believing science could unlock solutions for diseases that still had no cure. She had been proud of that work. Then funding disappeared, partnerships collapsed, and the ladder she had climbed carefully for more than a decade simply vanished beneath her feet. Since then, life had become a series of temporary steps, short-term jobs, shared apartments, eventually none at all. The shelter had been her last safe place before the future turned completely uncertain. Now a billionaire had placed an impossible choice in front of her. The next morning, Elena stepped outside into the sharp March air just after sunrise. Chicago mornings in early spring carried a kind of cold that slipped easily through coats and scarves. She walked 2 blocks down Monroe Street until she reached a small park bench and sat down, watching the city wake slowly around her. Delivery trucks rolled past. Commuters hurried toward the train station with paper coffee cups in their hands. Somewhere above the tall buildings the sun pushed through a thin layer of gray clouds. Elena held the folder on her lap and wondered what her life would look like 1 year from now if she signed the last page. $2 million could restart her research. It could fund the medical treatments her younger sister still needed in Minnesota. But he had not spent much time imagining that particular conversation. Finally, he answered honestly, "I will tell them the truth." Elena tilted her head slightly. That their life began as a contract. Daniel paused again, then nodded once. Yes. Elena watched him carefully, measuring the weight of his words. For the first time she noticed something unexpected behind his composed confidence. A quiet loneliness that no amount of success had managed to erase. She opened the folder and turned to the final page. The line for her signature waited beneath a block of legal text that would transform the next year of her life completely. Daniel Carter stood silently across from her, not pushing, not persuading, simply waiting the way someone waits for the final moment in a negotiation. Elena picked up the pen clipped to the inside cover and held it for a second as the sounds of the city moved around them. Cars passing, wind brushing along the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, the elevated train rattled across the tracks. Then she placed the pen on the paper and signed her name slowly and clearly. Elena Brooks. Daniel exhaled almost imperceptibly, as if the final piece of a complicated plan had just fallen perfectly into place. Yet as he accepted the folder back from her hands, he felt an unfamiliar sense that this agreement might not follow the simple path he expected. Because something in Elena Brooks suggested that the future of this contract would hold far more than numbers and signatures. The following morning the city looked different to Elena Brooks, though the same cold Chicago wind still swept between the tall buildings, and the same early commuters still rushed toward the train stations with coffee cups in their hands. The difference was invisible to everyone except her. Somewhere in a leather folder now locked inside Daniel Carter's downtown office safe was a signed agreement that had quietly redirected the path of her entire future. At exactly 8:30, a black sedan pulled up in front of the shelter once again. Elena stepped outside carrying a small canvas bag containing everything she still owned, a few books, a folded sweater, and a worn notebook filled with old research ideas she had never stopped thinking about. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door without saying much. Elena hesitated for just a second before getting inside, and the car pulled smoothly into the morning traffic heading north through downtown Chicago. Daniel Carter was already waiting when she arrived at a modern glass tower overlooking the Chicago River. The building was the headquarters of Carter Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country, and from the outside it looked exactly like what it was, a place where powerful decisions shaped entire industries. Elena stepped into the lobby and glanced up at the soaring ceiling and polished stone floors. The shelter on Monroe Street felt very far away now. A receptionist guided her to a private elevator that carried her to the 32nd floor, where Daniel's office occupied the entire corner of the building. When the doors opened, Daniel stood near the large windows looking out across the river and the moving lines of morning traffic below. For a moment he did not turn around because he was finishing a phone call. Finished, she asked a simple question that slightly disrupted the rhythm of his explanation. "Why did you choose Chicago for this?" she asked. Daniel paused. "Because this is where my company began," he answered. "And because I prefer to manage important things personally." Elena noticed the way he used the word things instead of people. She did not comment on it, but the thought lingered in her mind. A moment later, Daniel reached into a drawer and placed a small envelope on the table between them. "This is the first transfer payment," he said. $50,000 as specified in the contract. Elena looked at the envelope but did not open it. The amount of money felt surreal compared to the life she had been living only a few days earlier. Daniel watched her reaction carefully. Most people would have immediately checked the contents. Elena simply nodded once and slipped the envelope into her bag without counting it. That small gesture caught Daniel's attention more than he expected. A soft knock sounded at the door, and a tall man entered the office carrying a thin tablet. His suit was as precise as Daniel's, but his expression carried a sharper edge. Elena recognized him from the contract paperwork. Marcus Doyle, the attorney who had prepared the legal agreement. "Good morning, Marcus," Daniel said. Marcus nodded politely toward Elena, though his eyes studied her with quiet calculation. "Everything is finalized on the legal side," he said. "All documentation has been filed, and the clinic is prepared to begin preliminary evaluations tomorrow morning. Elena noticed something subtle in Marcus Doyle's tone, a kind of restrained skepticism that suggested he did not fully trust the situation unfolding in front of him. Daniel, however, seemed unconcerned. "Thank you, Marcus," he said. "That will be all for now." Marcus nodded again and left the room. As the door closed, Elena looked toward Daniel. "Your lawyer does not seem very enthusiastic about this arrangement," she said calmly. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "Marcus is enthusiastic about control," he replied. "Unexpected variables make him uncomfortable." Elena thought about that for a moment. "Life itself is an unexpected variable," she said. Daniel did not argue with her. Instead, he walked toward the window again and looked down at the city moving beneath them. For most of his life, he had believed that discipline and logic could predict almost any outcome. Yet standing there beside Elena Brooks, he felt the quiet awareness that this particular decision might introduce something entirely unfamiliar into his carefully structured world. Something no contract could fully measure. And somewhere deep in the complicated plan that had just begun, the future was already starting to move in ways neither of them could see yet. The apartment Daniel Carter arranged for Elena Brooks overlooked Lake Michigan from the 21st floor of a quiet residential tower on the north side of Chicago, and the moment Elena stepped inside, she realized how completely her life had shifted within less than 48 hours. Sunlight streamed through tall windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting softly off the pale wooden floors and the calm blue water beyond the skyline. The apartment was not extravagant in a flashy way. Instead, it carried the kind of thoughtful elegance that suggested everything had been chosen carefully. A comfortable sofa faced the windows. A small dining table stood near an open kitchen stocked with groceries. Even the bedroom carried a quiet simplicity that made the space feel calm rather than overwhelming. For someone who had spent weeks sleeping in a shelter bunk, the silence alone felt almost unreal. Elena set her canvas bag on the kitchen counter and slowly walked through each room, touching the smooth surfaces of the furniture as if confirming that the place truly existed. She paused by the window and looked down at the traffic moving along Lakeshore Drive far below. Chicago stretched around her in steel and glass, a city she had known for years, yet now felt strangely unfamiliar. The contract had changed everything, but Elena understood that the real challenge had only just begun. The following morning, a driver arrived at exactly 8 o'clock to take her to Northwestern Memorial Hospital for the first stage of medical evaluations required by the agreement. The hospital stood only a few blocks from the apartment, a massive complex of glass corridors and quiet waiting rooms where specialists moved quickly between appointments. Elena sat in a consultation room while a physician explained the process with professional clarity. Tests, monitoring, nutritional planning, and a long schedule of routine checkups would follow over the coming months. The clinic handled complex cases regularly, but even the staff seemed aware that their newest patient was connected to one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the country. Elena answered every question carefully and remained calm throughout the examinations. Years earlier, she had worked in laboratories surrounded by scientific equipment, so the clinical environment did not intimidate her. What unsettled her slightly was the awareness that her life had become part of a carefully structured project controlled by someone else. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel Carter continued his normal routine as if nothing unusual had happened. His mornings still began at 6:30 with financial briefings and conference calls with executives in other time zones. Carter Dynamics was preparing to launch a new artificial intelligence platform, and investors expected Daniel to maintain his usual sharp focus. Yet between meetings, his mind returned unexpectedly to the image of Elena Brooks standing quietly in his office the day before. She did not behave the way most people behaved around power or money. There was no eagerness, no nervous flattery, only a steady calm that made him slightly curious about what she was thinking when she looked out across the city from his window. Late that afternoon, Daniel reviewed a progress update sent by the clinic confirming that Elena's evaluations had gone smoothly. Marcus Doyle stood beside his desk reading the same report on his tablet. The attorney's expression carried a thoughtful seriousness that Daniel recognized well. Marcus had been working with him for more than 10 years and rarely hesitated to speak his mind. "You realize this arrangement carries more uncertainty than you usually tolerate," Marcus said. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Every investment carries uncertainty, he replied. Marcus crossed his arms. Investments do not usually involve human lives quite this directly. Daniel looked at him calmly. The agreement is legal, ethical, and fully documented, he said. Marcus nodded slowly, but did not appear completely satisfied. I am not questioning the legality, he said. I am questioning the unpredictability. Daniel gave a faint smile. That is why we wrote the contract so carefully. Marcus hesitated before answering. Contracts control transactions, Daniel. They rarely control people. That comment lingered in the quiet office for a moment before Marcus excused himself and left. Daniel remained seated at his desk, staring briefly at the skyline outside his window. For the first time, he considered the possibility that Marcus might be partially right. Human lives followed emotional paths that even the most detailed legal language could not fully guide. Several days passed as Elena adjusted to her new routine. Morning medical visits alternated with quiet afternoons in the apartment, where she began reviewing old research notes from the worn notebook she had carried through months of uncertainty. The stability of the apartment allowed her mind to focus again on the scientific ideas she had once pursued passionately. One evening, while organizing papers on the dining table, she noticed a message on the secure phone Daniel had provided for communication related to the agreement. The message contained only a short line from him. I would like to check on your progress. Dinner tomorrow evening, if you are comfortable with that. Elena read the message twice before setting the phone down beside her notebook. She had expected the arrangement to remain mostly formal and distant, managed through assistants and medical staff. Yet Daniel Carter seemed unexpectedly interested in maintaining direct contact. She walked to the window again and looked out at the glowing lights of Chicago stretching across the lakefront. Somewhere in that city, the man who had designed this unusual plan was now waiting for her answer, and Elena sensed that their next conversation might begin to change the simple structure of the agreement in ways neither of them had predicted. The restaurant Daniel Carter chose for dinner overlooked the Chicago River, where evening lights shimmered across the dark water, and the soft hum of conversation filled the elegant dining room. Elena Brooks stepped inside a few minutes before 7 and paused briefly near the entrance as she adjusted to the warm golden lighting and the quiet rhythm of waiters moving between tables. Only a few weeks earlier, she had been eating soup from a paper bowl inside a shelter on Monroe Street, and now she found herself standing in a place where people discussed investments and market strategies over polished glasses and candlelight. A host greeted her politely and led her to a table near the windows where Daniel was already seated reviewing something on his phone. When he looked up and saw her approach, he stood immediately, a small gesture of courtesy that seemed natural rather than rehearsed. I am glad you came, he said. Elena took the seat across from him and glanced briefly at the river outside where the city lights reflected in long shimmering lines across the water. You said you wanted to check on my progress, she replied calmly. Daniel set the phone aside and nodded. I did. The clinic sent the initial evaluation report this afternoon. Everything appears normal. Elena allowed herself a small smile. That is good to hear. A waiter approached to take their order, and Daniel suggested a simple dinner rather than anything overly formal. When the waiter left, Elena noticed something different about Daniel's expression compared to the previous times they had spoken. In his office, he had seemed like a man constantly calculating the next step in a strategy. Here he looked slightly more relaxed, as if the conversation might not follow a structured agenda. The apartment is comfortable, he said after a moment. Elena nodded. It is more than comfortable. It is peaceful. Daniel studied her quietly for a second. Most people would have asked for additional things by now, he said. Furniture changes, entertainment systems, something expensive. Elena raised one eyebrow. You already provided everything necessary. Daniel smiled faintly. Necessity and luxury often become confused in situations like this. Elena looked down at the menu but did not open it immediately. When someone has been without stability for a long time, simple things become valuable again. A quiet place to think. A window with sunlight. Daniel listened carefully. Her answer reminded him again that Elena Brooks approached life differently from the people he usually encountered in business circles. Dinner arrived soon afterward, and for a few minutes their conversation shifted toward lighter topics. Elena spoke briefly about her years in scientific research and the long nights she once spent analyzing molecular patterns inside laboratory computers. Daniel admitted that he had always been fascinated by biology because it represented a level of complexity even the most advanced software struggled to imitate. You see systems everywhere, Elena observed thoughtfully. Daniel nodded. Systems create predictable outcomes. Elena took a sip of water and looked toward the river again. Biology is rarely predictable, she said. That is what makes it interesting. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, as if considering that idea. The difference between them became clearer in that moment. Daniel Carter believed the world could be managed through structure and control. Elena Brooks understood that life often unfolded through uncertainty. Their agreement had brought those two perspectives together in a way neither of them had expected. After dinner, the waiter cleared the table, and the restaurant grew quieter as some of the earlier guests began leaving. Daniel glanced toward the window where the city skyline reflected across the river. There is something I should explain, he said. Elena looked back at him with quiet curiosity. My father believed strongly in legacy, Daniel continued. He built Carter Industries from almost nothing. Every decision he made focused on what would remain after he was gone. Elena listened carefully without interrupting. When he died last year, I realized that everything I had built might eventually disappear if I left no one behind to continue it, Daniel said. Elena tilted her head slightly. That sounds less like business strategy and more like loneliness. Daniel did not immediately respond to that observation. Instead, he watched the slow movement of a boat passing beneath the bridge outside. Perhaps it is both, he said finally. Elena considered his words. Legacy is not always about bloodlines or companies, she said quietly. Sometimes it is about the way one person changes another person's life. Daniel met her eyes again, and for the first time since they had met, there was a hint of uncertainty in his expression. That idea had never been part of his calculations before. They left the restaurant a few minutes later and stepped outside into the cool Chicago night. The wind carried the faint scent of the river as cars moved steadily along the streets nearby. Daniel's driver waited at the curb, but neither of them moved toward the car immediately. Elena looked up at the skyline where thousands of windows glowed against the dark sky. You know something interesting about science, she said thoughtfully. Daniel waited for her to continue. The most important discoveries often begin with experiments that do not follow the expected results. Daniel considered that statement carefully. Somewhere deep inside his carefully structured plan, a quiet realization was beginning to form. Perhaps the agreement he had designed so precisely was becoming something far more complicated than a simple contract. And as the city lights reflected across the water beside them, the future of their unusual arrangement was already starting to shift in ways neither of them fully understood yet. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that neither Daniel Carter nor Elena Brooks had originally expected when the contract was signed on Monroe Street. Chicago moved steadily from the cold, gray days of early spring toward the softer sunlight of April, and inside the quiet apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Elena began to build a routine that felt almost normal. Each morning started with a walk along the lakefront path where runners and cyclists passed beneath the tall skyline, while the wind carried the fresh scent of the water. The medical team monitored every step of the process carefully, and the clinic visits became familiar rather than intimidating. Elena approached each appointment with the same analytical calm she once used in the laboratory. For her, this situation had gradually shifted from an abstract agreement into something more personal, something that demanded attention not only from doctors and lawyers, but also from the quieter parts of her own thoughts. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter continued managing the expanding empire of Carter Dynamics. But even his tightly structured schedule had begun to include occasional interruptions connected to Elena's progress. The updates from the clinic arrived regularly, and although Daniel rarely reacted openly to them, he read every report with careful attention. On one particular afternoon, Marcus Doyle stepped into Daniel's office carrying a new set of documents. The attorney placed the tablet on the desk and folded his arms. The clinic confirms everything is progressing normally, Marcus said. Daniel nodded once without looking up from the skyline outside his window. That is expected, he replied. Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking again. You have met with her several times now outside the formal requirements of the agreement. Daniel turned his chair slightly. I wanted to ensure she remains comfortable with the process, he said. Marcus allowed a small skeptical smile. That explanation sounds more like a personal interest than a legal responsibility. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward the river far below where afternoon sunlight reflected across the water in slow-moving patterns. Marcus had always been a precise observer, and Daniel knew that ignoring the comment would only make the conversation longer. "She is an unusual person," Daniel said finally. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, I noticed that as well. Elena Brooks does not react to wealth the way most people do." That observation lingered between them for a moment before Marcus added something more serious. "Unusual people sometimes introduce unpredictable outcomes," he said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "That possibility exists in every major decision." Marcus tapped the tablet once before leaving the office. "Just remember that the agreement was designed to control the outcome," he said quietly. Daniel watched the door close, and for the first time considered whether Marcus might again be correct. Later that evening, Elena sat near the apartment window with her notebook open on the table. Pages filled with chemical diagrams and research notes covered the surface beside a cup of tea that had grown cold while she worked. The stability of the past few weeks had allowed her mind to return to scientific questions she once believed were lost forever. She had even begun drafting a proposal for a new research project, something she hoped to pursue once the agreement was completed and the financial support promised in the contract became available. A soft chime sounded from the secure phone Daniel had provided, and Elena looked down to see a brief message appear on the screen. Daniel Carter had written only a single sentence. "The clinic mentioned you had another evaluation today. I hope everything went smoothly." Elena hesitated before replying. The process was proceeding exactly as expected, and she could have answered with a simple confirmation. Yet something about Daniel's message suggested that he was asking about more than medical results. After a moment, she typed a response. "Everything is normal. The doctor says the next few months will be important." She set the phone down and returned to her notes, but only a few seconds later the screen lit up again. "That is good to hear," Daniel wrote. "If you need anything, please let me know." Elena smiled faintly at the formality of the sentence. Even in a casual message, Daniel Carter communicated like a man drafting an agreement. Still, the message carried a sincerity she had begun to recognize in their conversations. She typed another response before overthinking the decision. "I do not need anything at the moment, but thank you for asking." A few minutes passed without another reply, and Elena returned to the quiet focus of her research notes. Outside the apartment window, the lights of Chicago stretched across the shoreline like a constellation of gold reflections on the lake. Somewhere across the city, Daniel Carter stood in his office looking out at the same skyline from a different angle. The agreement between them still existed exactly as written, a precise legal framework designed to guide the months ahead. Yet slowly, almost invisibly, something else had begun to grow alongside it. Not a clause or a payment schedule, but a connection formed through small conversations and shared moments that neither contract language nor careful planning had predicted. And although neither of them spoke about it directly, both Daniel and Elena could sense that the future of their arrangement was beginning to move toward a direction far more complicated than the one that had started with a simple signature on a quiet Chicago afternoon. By early May, the city of Chicago had begun to warm under longer days of sunlight, and the steady rhythm that had formed between Daniel Carter and Elena Brooks continued quietly beneath the surface of their unusual agreement. Elena's appointments at Northwestern Memorial Hospital had become routine, each visit confirming that the process outlined in the contract was progressing exactly as expected. The doctors were calm, the medical reports remained reassuring, and the apartment overlooking Lake Michigan had slowly begun to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like a place where Elena could think clearly again. Yet alongside that stability, another quiet shift was beginning to take shape, one that neither the clinic nor the legal documents could measure. Elena noticed it during small moments, like the evenings when Daniel occasionally stopped by the apartment after work, bringing simple dinners instead of the formal restaurant settings they had visited earlier. The first time he arrived carrying 2 paper bags from a neighborhood Italian restaurant, she had laughed softly, because the most powerful technology executive in Chicago looked slightly awkward holding takeout containers like a college student. They ate at the small dining table near the window while the lights of the lakefront shimmered in the distance, and the conversation drifted far away from contracts or medical reports. Daniel spoke about the early days of Carter Dynamics, when the company had been only 3 people working inside a cramped office with borrowed equipment. Elena listened with genuine curiosity, asking questions that made him realize how rarely anyone spoke to him without an agenda. Most people around Daniel were investors, executives, or lawyers who measured every conversation carefully. Elena Brooks simply asked what she wanted to understand. On another evening, Elena showed Daniel the research notebook she had carried through the difficult years before they met. Page after page contained diagrams of molecular pathways and handwritten notes describing ideas she once hoped to explore in a laboratory. Daniel studied the pages thoughtfully. "You never stopped working on these ideas," he observed. Elena shook her head gently. "Curiosity does not disappear just because funding does," she said. Daniel leaned back in the chair and considered that statement. In business, he had always believed that resources determined progress, but Elena seemed to approach discovery as something deeper than opportunity. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus Doyle continued watching the situation with increasing attention. One afternoon, he walked into Daniel's office holding a tablet filled with financial projections and legal updates. "Everything related to the agreement remains on schedule," Marcus said, "but I have noticed a pattern developing that may require caution." Daniel looked up from the documents on his desk. "What pattern?" Marcus placed the tablet down. "You are spending a considerable amount of time with Elena Brooks beyond the requirements of the contract." Daniel remained calm. "The arrangement involves significant personal responsibility." Marcus folded his arms slightly. "Responsibility does not usually include sharing takeout dinners and discussing scientific research notebooks." Daniel gave a small smile that did not fully answer the concern. Marcus sighed quietly. "I am simply reminding you that the contract was written to maintain clear boundaries." Daniel glanced toward the window where the afternoon sun reflected across the river. "Boundaries are still intact," he said. Marcus did not argue further, but the uncertainty in his expression suggested he was not entirely convinced. That same evening, Elena stood on the balcony outside the apartment watching the last orange light fade across Lake Michigan when her phone chimed with a new message from Daniel. "Are you free tomorrow morning?" the message read. Elena responded that she was available. A few minutes later, another message appeared. "I would like to show you something." At 10 o'clock the next morning, Daniel's car arrived and drove them south along the shoreline until the tall buildings of downtown Chicago rose again in front of them. Elena expected another clinic appointment or perhaps a business meeting, but instead Daniel directed the driver toward a quiet research district near the university campus. The car stopped in front of a large brick building that appeared to be undergoing renovation. Elena stepped out and looked at the structure curiously. "What is this place?" she asked. Daniel walked beside her toward the entrance where construction workers were finishing the final details of the interior. "It used to be a small biomedical laboratory that closed 3 years ago," he explained. Elena looked at him with surprise. "Why are we here?" Daniel opened the door and gestured for her to step inside. The main room had been completely redesigned with modern equipment, bright lighting, and rows of empty laboratory benches waiting for researchers. Elena's eyes widened as she slowly walked across the polished floor. Daniel watched her reaction carefully. "If your research proposal becomes ready after the agreement is completed," he said quietly, "this facility could be available." Elena turned toward him with disbelief. "You are serious?" Daniel nodded once. "Carter Foundation has been considering funding new biomedical programs for some time." Elena looked around the room again, imagining experiments and discoveries that had once seemed impossible after her career collapsed. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply absorbing the possibility standing in front of her. Daniel finally spoke again with a calm voice. "Sometimes the most important discoveries begin with unexpected partnerships," he said. Elena remembered the same idea she had mentioned weeks earlier during their dinner by the river, and she realized that their unusual arrangement had begun transforming both of their lives in ways neither of them had predicted when the contract was first signed. The renovated laboratory building remained quiet after Daniel Carter finished explaining his idea, and for a moment Elena Brooks simply stood in the middle of the bright open room trying to absorb what she was seeing. Stainless steel workstations lined the walls, each one equipped with advanced microscopes and analysis equipment that looked far newer than anything she had used during her years at the Research Institute. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the polished floors and empty benches waiting for researchers who had not yet arrived. Elena slowly walked along one of the tables and ran her fingers lightly across the smooth surface, as if confirming that the opportunity in front of her was real. Only a few months earlier she had believed that part of her life was permanently closed. Now Daniel Carter had quietly reopened a door she never expected to see again. Daniel watched her reaction carefully without interrupting. For a man who spent most of his time negotiating billion-dollar investments, this moment felt strangely personal. Elena finally turned toward him with a thoughtful expression. "Why would you do this?" she asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to one of the large windows and looked out across the university campus, where students moved between buildings under the warm spring sunlight. Carter Foundation already funds several research programs, he said calmly. Expanding that work is a logical step. Elena tilted her head slightly. "That explanation sounds like the one you would give to investors," she replied. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile, because she had once again noticed the difference between his public reasoning and his private motivations. "Perhaps it is also something else," he admitted. Elena waited quietly. Daniel turned back toward her. "When we first met you said curiosity does not disappear simply because circumstances change," he said. That idea stayed with me. Elena looked down briefly at the notebook she was still holding in her hand. "Scientific questions have a way of following you for a lifetime," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "Exactly." The two of them stood in the quiet laboratory for several minutes, discussing the possibilities for future research programs. Elena described a project she had once hoped to pursue involving molecular signaling pathways related to autoimmune diseases. Daniel listened carefully, even though the technical details were far outside his own field of expertise. What interested him most was the energy in Elena's voice as she explained the ideas. For the first time since they had met, he could see the version of Elena Brooks, who once led a promising research team rather than the woman who had arrived at a shelter carrying a single canvas bag. Yet as hopeful as the moment felt, something else was beginning to move quietly beneath the surface of their arrangement. Across the city, Marcus Doyle had spent the afternoon reviewing a new set of financial updates connected to Carter Foundation. One particular entry caught his attention. A large investment had been transferred to the research property Daniel had just shown Elena. Marcus leaned back in his chair and stared at the numbers thoughtfully. The decision was technically within Daniel's authority, but the timing suggested something more personal than strategic planning. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed Daniel's direct line. Daniel answered calmly from the laboratory building. "Marcus, what is it?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "I noticed the foundation has acquired a biomedical facility near the university district." Daniel glanced briefly toward Elena before responding. "That is correct." Marcus paused for a moment. "May I ask whether this decision is connected to your current arrangement?" Daniel did not hesitate. "In part, yes." Marcus sighed quietly. "Daniel, you hired me to protect your interests. That includes warning you when a situation begins moving beyond the boundaries we established." Daniel stepped closer to the window again. "The boundaries are still intact, Marcus. The agreement remains exactly as written." Marcus lowered his voice slightly. "Contracts can change people in unexpected ways." Daniel looked across the laboratory where Elena was studying a microscope on one of the benches with quiet fascination. "Perhaps that is not always a problem," he said. Marcus did not respond immediately. "Just remember that every agreement has consequences beyond the signatures," he said before ending the call. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned toward Elena again. She looked up from the equipment and smiled slightly. "Your lawyer sounds concerned," she observed. Daniel shrugged lightly. "Marcus prefers predictable outcomes." Elena walked back toward the center of the room where the sunlight created long reflections across the floor. "Life rarely provides those," she said. Daniel nodded slowly because he had begun to realize the same thing. What started as a carefully structured agreement was gradually becoming something far more complex than either of them expected. And somewhere in the months ahead, the most surprising part of their story had not even begun to reveal itself yet. Summer arrived gradually across Chicago, bringing warm sunlight over Lake Michigan and longer evenings that stretched across the skyline. By the time June settled into the city, Elena Brooks had begun to notice changes not only in her daily routine, but also in the quiet rhythm of the life growing inside her. The doctors at Northwestern Memorial Hospital monitored everything carefully, and each appointment confirmed that the pregnancy was progressing normally. Elena approached the process with the same thoughtful discipline she once applied to her scientific work. She read every report, asked precise questions, and followed the medical guidance with calm focus. Yet beyond the clinical details, something far more personal had begun to develop. One evening she stood in the apartment kitchen preparing a simple dinner when she felt a small, unfamiliar movement for the first time. It was subtle, almost like a faint ripple beneath the surface, but it was enough to make her pause and place her hand gently against her stomach. The moment felt quiet and strangely powerful, reminding her that the agreement she had signed months earlier had grown into something living and real. Later that night, she sent Daniel Carter a short message explaining what had happened. The reply arrived almost immediately. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Elena smiled slightly at the concern in his words. "Yes," she answered. "The doctor said this moment would arrive soon." Daniel read the message while standing in his office overlooking the Chicago River. The lights of the city reflected across the water as evening traffic moved steadily along the streets below. For most of his life, Daniel had approached every major decision with careful emotional distance. Yet the message from Elena created a reaction he had not anticipated. He found himself imagining the future in ways that felt unfamiliar. The child had originally been part of a calculated plan to secure a legacy, but now the idea of that future carried something deeper than strategy. The following afternoon, Daniel visited the apartment with a calm expression that almost concealed the curiosity he felt. Elena opened the door and noticed that he seemed slightly different from the man who had first arrived at the shelter months earlier. Something about his posture suggested that the situation had become more personal for him as well. They sat near the window where sunlight poured across the living room floor while Elena described the clinic appointment and the doctor's explanation of the new stage of development. Daniel listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the medical details. Elena eventually laughed softly. "You are asking questions like a researcher," she said. Daniel shrugged lightly. "I prefer to understand the systems I am involved in." Elena looked at him with a thoughtful smile. "Life is not always a system," she replied. "Sometimes it is simply a story unfolding one day at a time." Daniel considered that idea while looking out at the lake beyond the glass windows. In business, he had always focused on outcomes measured by numbers and projections, yet the future he was now imagining felt far less predictable. Meanwhile, Marcus Doyle had grown increasingly uneasy with the direction of events. The attorney reviewed the latest updates connected to Carter Foundation and noticed that Daniel had continued investing additional resources into the laboratory facility Elena had visited earlier. Marcus understood the importance of supporting scientific research, but the pattern suggested something more complicated than philanthropy. One afternoon, he requested a meeting with Daniel inside the Carter Dynamics headquarters. Daniel arrived on time as usual and took a seat across the polished conference table while Marcus organized several documents. "The financial commitments related to the research facility have expanded significantly," Marcus said. Daniel nodded calmly. "The project has strong potential." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Potential for research, or potential for someone you have become personally invested in?" Daniel did not react immediately. Instead, he looked toward the glass walls of the conference room, where the busy office floor stretched beyond. Marcus spoke again with quiet seriousness. "When you first explained the agreement months ago, it was clear and controlled. Now the situation appears to be evolving into something else." Daniel finally met his lawyer's gaze. "Perhaps it is evolving because life rarely follows the original blueprint," he said. Marcus shook his head slowly. "That may be true, but every change introduces new consequences." Daniel stood and walked toward the window overlooking the river below. The sunlight reflected across the water exactly the same way it had on the day he first met Elena Brooks, yet everything else had shifted in ways he had not predicted. Behind him, Marcus remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "There is another matter you should consider," he said. Daniel turned back toward the table. "What is it?" Marcus placed a small envelope on the polished surface. "The clinic completed a new genetic screening this morning as part of the routine medical process." Daniel walked back toward the table slowly, noticing the unusual seriousness in Marcus Doyle's expression. For the first time since the agreement began, a quiet uncertainty entered the room. Because the document inside the envelope suggested that the carefully planned future Daniel Carter had been building might soon reveal a truth far more surprising than anything he had imagined. Daniel Carter stared at the envelope Marcus Doyle had placed on the conference table, sensing immediately that the thin document inside carried far more weight than its size suggested. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass walls of the office, reflecting softly across the polished surface while the distant movement of Chicago traffic continued far below the tower. Marcus remained silent, allowing the moment to stretch just long enough for Daniel to understand that this was not a routine update from the clinic. Slowly Daniel reached forward and opened the envelope, sliding the medical report from inside. The paper contained the results of the routine genetic screening that had been conducted earlier that week as part of the pregnancy monitoring process. For several seconds, Daniel simply read the first paragraph without speaking. The language was clinical and precise, describing genetic markers, probability ranges, and comparative analysis between the biological material that had been provided at the beginning of the agreement and the developing child now months into pregnancy. At first, the details seemed like standard confirmation of expected results. But as Daniel reached the final section, his eyes paused on a line that made him read the sentence again. Marcus watched carefully from across the table. "You see the discrepancy," he said quietly. Daniel looked up slowly, the calm confidence that usually defined his expression replaced by something more uncertain. "According to this analysis," he said carefully, "the genetic markers do not fully match the sample provided by the clinic." Marcus nodded once. "That is correct." The laboratory repeated the comparison twice before issuing the report. Daniel placed the document back on the table and leaned back slightly in his chair, as if his mind needed a moment to reorganize the information. "Are they suggesting the analysis is incorrect?" he asked. Marcus shook his head. "The clinic has one of the most reliable genetic testing facilities in the region. Their confidence level is extremely high." Daniel looked again at the paper where the conclusion remained clear. The child Elena Brooks was carrying might not share the exact genetic profile Daniel Carter had expected when the agreement was signed months earlier. For a moment, the quiet conference room seemed almost suspended in time. Daniel had spent his entire career believing that carefully structured systems produced predictable outcomes, yet the document in front of him suggested that something inside the plan had shifted in ways no contract could control. Marcus finally broke the silence. "The clinic has requested permission to conduct additional testing to confirm the data," he said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Of course." Marcus studied his reaction carefully. "There is another consideration you should prepare for." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Explain." Marcus folded his hands on the table. "Elena Brooks has not been informed of this result yet. The clinic contacted us first because the agreement lists you as the primary legal party responsible for the medical oversight." Daniel remained silent for a moment, thinking through the implications. "Eventually she will see the same report," Marcus continued. "When that happens, there will be questions." Daniel stood and walked toward the tall window overlooking the Chicago River. The water moved calmly beneath the bridges as boats passed slowly between the buildings. From this height, the city appeared orderly and structured, just like the world Daniel had always believed he understood. Yet the document on the table suggested that the future unfolding in front of him might be far more complicated than the plan he had designed. Later that evening, Daniel drove across the city toward the apartment where Elena was staying. The sun had already begun to set, casting long orange reflections across Lake Michigan as he entered the quiet building lobby. Elena opened the door with a calm smile, unaware that the day had brought unexpected news. She noticed immediately that Daniel looked thoughtful. "Everything all right?" she asked gently. Daniel stepped inside and glanced toward the window where the lake stretched into the evening horizon. "I received an update from the clinic today," he said carefully. Elena's expression remained relaxed. "Is the baby healthy?" "Yes," Daniel answered. "The medical reports show everything progressing normally." Elena exhaled softly with relief. "That is good." Daniel hesitated for a moment before continuing. However, there was another result included in the genetic analysis. Elena studied his face more closely now, sensing the shift in his tone. "What kind of result?" she asked. Daniel reached into his jacket and placed the folded report on the table between them. "The clinic believes there may be a variation in the genetic markers they expected to see." Elena picked up the paper slowly and read the same lines Daniel had studied earlier that afternoon. As the meaning settled in, she looked up again with quiet confusion. "Are they saying the child might not share your exact genetic profile?" Daniel nodded slightly. "That is the implication of the initial analysis." Elena placed the report back on the table and sat down, processing the information carefully. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, she asked the question that had begun forming in her mind. How is that possible? Daniel looked toward the darkening lake outside the window. That is exactly what we need to find out, he said quietly, unaware that the answer to that question would soon reveal a truth that would change both of their lives far more deeply than either of them expected. The quiet apartment overlooking Lake Michigan felt heavier after the words from the clinic report settled between Daniel Carter and Elena Brooks. Outside the wide glass windows, the evening sky had darkened into deep blue while the distant lights of Chicago shimmered along the shoreline. Elena remained seated at the table with the folded report resting beside her hand, reading the same lines again as if the meaning might change the second time. Daniel stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, staring out across the water while his thoughts moved carefully through every possible explanation. For a man who had spent his life trusting data and controlled systems, the unexpected result challenged a belief he had relied on for decades. Elena finally looked up from the report and spoke with the calm clarity that had always defined her thinking. The clinic repeated the test twice, she said. That means they are confident about the result. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Elena leaned back slightly in her chair and exhaled. Then the question becomes whether the sample used in the original procedure was correct. Daniel turned toward her. That possibility occurred to me as well. The clinic stored all biological materials under strict tracking systems, but even precise systems sometimes encounter human error. Elena looked down at the paper again. If there was a mistake during the early stages, the genetic comparison could show unexpected markers even though the pregnancy itself developed normally. Daniel walked back toward the table and sat across from her. The doctors have already scheduled another test to confirm the findings. Elena folded her hands calmly. I will cooperate with whatever they need. Her steady reaction surprised Daniel slightly because many people might have responded with panic or anger. Elena Brooks approached the situation like a scientist evaluating new data. After several moments of silence, she asked the question that had been forming quietly in her mind. If the second test confirms the difference, what will you do? Daniel looked at the skyline through the window for a moment before answering. The agreement was written around specific assumptions. But life has a way of changing. Those assumptions. Elena studied him carefully. That sounds like the beginning of a complicated decision. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. Most important decisions are complicated. The following morning they returned together to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where the medical team prepared for the additional genetic screening. The clinic staff explained the procedure calmly and reassured them that such tests were routine when any irregularity appeared in earlier results. Elena listened carefully as the doctor described how the laboratory would compare genetic markers again using more advanced sequencing technology. Daniel stood beside her while the doctor spoke, noticing how naturally Elena absorbed the technical explanations. She asked precise questions about probability margins and laboratory protocols, and the doctor answered with professional respect. Once the testing process was completed, they were told the results would be ready within 48 hours. The waiting period created a quiet tension that neither of them mentioned directly. Elena returned to the apartment and spent the afternoon reviewing research notes at the dining table, but her concentration drifted repeatedly toward the possible outcomes. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to Carter Dynamics headquarters where the usual rhythm of corporate decisions continued around him. Investors called. Executives requested approval for new projects. Yet even while he signed documents and participated in conference calls, his attention kept returning to the question raised by the clinic report. Late that afternoon, Marcus Doyle entered the office again carrying a tablet filled with legal updates. The second test has already been initiated, Marcus said, hand gently on her stomach and looked out at the darkening horizon. There is something you should know, she said softly. Daniel waited. I never saw this agreement only as a transaction, Elena continued. From the moment the process began, it became a responsibility. Daniel listened without interrupting. Whatever the test results say, she added, the life growing here is real. Daniel felt the weight of her words settle into the quiet room. For the first time since he had opened the envelope in Marcus Doyle's office, the question in front of him seemed larger than genetics or contracts. It was about the kind of future he wanted to build. 2 days later, the clinic would deliver the final analysis that confirmed the truth behind the unexpected genetic markers. And when that moment arrived, the decision Daniel Carter faced would reveal far more about his character than any business success ever had. 2 days later, the call from Northwestern Memorial Hospital arrived just after 9 in the morning, while the sunlight spread across Lake Michigan and the city of Chicago moved through another ordinary weekday. Elena Brooks was standing near the kitchen counter reviewing notes in her research notebook when her phone rang. The doctor's voice on the line was calm and professional, explaining that the second genetic analysis had been completed and the results were ready to be discussed in person. Elena listened carefully and thanked the doctor before ending the call. She stood quietly for a moment afterward, feeling the weight of the coming conversation settle into the room. Within the hour, Daniel Carter arrived at the apartment, his expression thoughtful but steady. Neither of them needed to explain why they were going back to the hospital together. The drive through the city passed mostly in silence as the black car moved along Lake Shore Drive, with the bright water stretching to the horizon on one side and the skyline rising on the other. When they reached the clinic, the doctor welcomed them into a private consultation room where a tablet displaying the final report rested on the desk. The physician spoke with the careful clarity that doctors use when delivering important information. The laboratory repeated the sequencing process with expanded markers and cross-referenced every sample used in the original procedure. The results confirmed that the developing child did not match the original genetic profile expected from the material Daniel Carter had provided months earlier. Elena listened calmly, her scientific background allowing her to follow every explanation without confusion. Daniel remained quiet beside her, absorbing the conclusion that the child he had planned for so carefully did not share the exact biological connection he once believed would define the future. The doctor continued speaking, explaining that the pregnancy itself remained perfectly healthy and that the discrepancy likely resulted from a sample handling error during the earliest stage of the process before the clinic received the materials. Such mistakes were extremely rare, but technically possible in complex medical environments where multiple laboratories handled specialized samples. When the explanation finished, the doctor asked whether they had any questions. Elena looked at Daniel briefly before speaking. The child is healthy and developing normally, correct? The doctor nodded. Everything is progressing exactly as we would hope. Elena thanked the physician and stood slowly while Daniel remained seated for one additional moment, staring at the report displayed on the tablet. For months he had built a future around a clear expectation. Now that expectation had shifted in a way no contract could rewrite. When they stepped outside the hospital, the warm summer air greeted them as the city continued moving around them without noticing that anything had changed. They walked quietly toward the car waiting at the curb. Elena rested one hand gently against her stomach while looking across the busy street. Daniel finally spoke after several moments. The agreement assumed a specific biological outcome, he said calmly. Elena nodded slightly. Yes, it did. Daniel opened the car door, but did not step inside immediately. Instead, he looked toward the skyline, rising above the river. I have spent my entire life believing that control creates certainty, he said. Elena studied him with quiet attention. And today you discovered something else, she replied softly. Daniel turned back toward her. Yes, that life does not always follow the structure we design. They returned to the apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, where the afternoon sunlight filled the living room with warm light. Elena sat near the window while Daniel stood on the balcony looking across the water that stretched endlessly beyond the shoreline. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel walked back inside and took the seat across from her. The contract we signed months ago defined responsibilities very clearly, he said. Elena, listen calmly. According to that agreement, you would receive financial security and the child would become part of my legacy. Elena nodded again. Daniel paused before continuing. But the contract did not anticipate this outcome. Elena looked directly at him. Contracts describe agreements, she said. They do not decide what kind of person someone chooses to be afterward. Daniel allowed himself a thoughtful smile at that statement. You always have a way of reducing complex problems to simple truths, he said. Elena shrugged gently. Science works the same way. Eventually the data leads you to the real conclusion. Daniel leaned back in the chair and glanced toward the research notebook resting on the table beside her. When this agreement began, I believed I was building a legacy defined by genetics and ownership, he said slowly. But over the past month, something else has become clear. Elena waited quietly. Legacy is not only about biology. It is about the choices we make and the lives we decide to stand beside. Elena felt the meaning behind his words even before he finished speaking. Daniel continued with calm certainty. The child you are carrying may not share my genetic code, but that does not change the fact that this life exists because of the decision we made together. Elena's eyes softened slightly. Daniel reached across the table and placed the original contract envelope beside her notebook. When we signed this document on Monroe Street, I believed it controlled the future, he said. Now I understand that the future is not controlled by paper or numbers. Elena looked down at the envelope and then back at him. What happens next? She asked quietly. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. We move forward as a family, he said. Not because a contract requires it, but because it is the choice that makes the most sense now. Elena looked toward the lake where the sunlight danced across the water and felt a quiet sense of peace settle into the moment. Months earlier, their story had begun with a calculated agreement between two strangers. Now it was ending with a decision that no legal document had predicted. And somewhere beyond the horizon of Lake Michigan, a new future was already beginning to unfold for both of them, shaped not by genetics or contracts, but by the simple human decision to care for the life they had created together.